A bold new prediction from a top Ukrainian general reveals how the tide of war could turn in just 6 critical months. This was the audacious claim made by Brigadier General Biletskyi, founder of the Azov Battalion and commander of the Ukrainian Third Army Corps, during a recent interview with Reuters. Speaking from an undisclosed bunker deep within the Kyiv region, Biletskyi laid out his timeline, stating, "I believe the next 6 to 9 months are a turning point. More precisely, I think the next 6 are the most critical." He suggests that if, within this period, Ukrainian forces can achieve significant battlefield advances, secure meaningful strategic gains, and, crucially, hold their ground against Russian troops, then Russia might be compelled to offer concessions at the negotiating table, potentially before the year concludes. This prospect, once practically unthinkable in 2022, that Ukraine could force a negotiating position favorable to a lasting truce, has become increasingly plausible as the summer of 2024 unfolds. Russian territorial gains have nearly ground to a halt, and month after month, Moscow has witnessed more of its troops perish on the front lines than it can recruit to replace them. Ukraine has achieved unprecedented dominance in drone warfare. Warning signs are flashing red across the Russian economy, and even Vladimir Putin's trusted elite are showing signs of waning faith in their leader. While Ukraine understands that the war is far from over and many things could still go wrong, maintaining its current course could finally bring peace within reach. According to General Biletskyi, Kyiv needs 6 crucial months to turn the tides of history. So, the countdown begins. 6 months to save Ukraine. Wednesday, June 3rd, was intended to be a momentous day for Vladimir Putin, who made a rare trip from his bunker to his beautiful and historic birth city, St. Petersburg. He wasn't there merely to reminisce or share vodka with childhood friends, but for business, the opening day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. This event has long been touted as Russia's answer to Davos, the Swiss alpine resort where global leaders and business elites convene annually for the World Economic Forum. Although Western heads of state would be conspicuously absent, as they have been since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin was poised to welcome dignitaries such as the presidents of Uzbekistan and Tanzania, Saudi Arabia's Minister of Energy, and even Chinese Vice President Han Zheng. This year, Putin had also secured the attendance of a range of Americans, from minor influencers to figures like Andrew and Tristan Tate, marking a crossover many found bewildering. However, as attendees made their way to the conference, a plume of heavy black smoke began to rise over the city. Flying low across the Baltic Sea and close enough to the city's skyline for conference-goers to capture on camera, Ukrainian drones and missiles rained down on St. Petersburg's major oil terminal, a naval base on a nearby island, and, according to the city governor, several other infrastructural targets. The city's main airport was forced to shut down for nearly 5 hours, with conference attendees snapping photos featuring unmistakable smoke trails in the background. Strangely, perhaps in a misguided attempt to save face, Russian air raid sirens never sounded. Yet, if Putin and his allies hoped the drones might fly off course, they were sorely mistaken. Russia, as usual, vowed a systematic response, a credible threat given that less than 48 hours prior, a wave of 656 drones and 73 missiles had killed at least 23 people across several Ukrainian cities. But just as that comprehensive strike and others like it have utterly failed to deter Ukraine's drone attacks, it is unlikely that a retaliation for St. Petersburg will achieve anything more. The conditions that allowed Ukraine to devastate St. Petersburg on one of Vladimir Putin's most important days this year are the very same conditions that enabled Brigadier General Biletskyi to issue his 6-month timeline. But before we delve into the details of what the next 6 months could hold, we must understand Biletskyi's prediction more thoroughly. Biletskyi and other Ukrainian leaders, including those who have since echoed his claims, are not suggesting that after 6 months, Ukraine will be marching on Moscow. Nor are they arguing that Ukraine is just 6 months away from retaking territory Russia has held since 2014, such as the Crimean Isthmus or the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. Instead, those 6 months represent the time Ukraine believes it needs to bring Russia to peace negotiations on terms favorable to Kyiv. Quoting Biletskyi again, "We need to define those directions, where we can improve our positions, take some strategic points, and then speak with the Russians from a position of strength, not weakness, about a truly stable truce." From a military point of view, this is realistic. Notably, the Chief of Staff to Ukraine's president, former battlefield commando Kyrylo Budanov, used the same word, realistic, in reference to a winter ceasefire. At the core of Biletskyi's assessment is the undeniable fact that something in Russia's offensive has fundamentally broken down. Since 2023, the war in Ukraine has followed a consistent pattern, as researcher Jack Watling explained in a recent piece for Foreign Affairs. Russia's full-scale invasion settled into a predictable rhythm of summer and winter offensives, between which the pressure of attacks would ease, while Russian units rotated and regrouped. However, even though Russia entered 2024 seemingly expecting to launch its usual spring and summer offensive, Ukraine has managed to turn the tide. Part of this shift is due to major improvements originating from Kyiv, where new drone and missile technology, particularly a pair of designs known as the Bumblebee and the Hornet, have completely revolutionized the battlefield. Impervious to Russian jamming and largely autonomous, Hornet drones, in particular, have been devastating the Russian military at medium range, anywhere from 25 to 250 kilometers from the front. Ukraine has relentlessly attacked supply depots, staging areas, weapons, stockpiles, and literally anything that moves, sowing such complete chaos that Russia cannot effectively organize and manage an offensive. Instead, Russian soldiers are increasingly caught off guard, often exposed, isolated, and highly vulnerable, even as their commanders force them to attempt forward progress. Ukraine's mid-range campaign has also led to the devastation of the highway that runs from the Russian border through parts of occupied Ukraine to Crimea, where nearly all above-ground oil infrastructure has now been destroyed. Already, the fuel shortage there is so severe that most civilians cannot use their cars. Although Russia might wish to send relief via the Kerch Strait Bridge, which directly connects Crimea to Russia, the bridge has sustained such significant undersea damage from repeated sea drone attacks that it is no longer safe for trains to cross. This is without even discussing Ukraine's long-range strike campaign, which has devastated Russian refineries, fuel storage infrastructure, and the military-industrial complex. These strikes are focused on drone and missile production facilities and highly specialized manufacturing centers that produce component parts Russia cannot make elsewhere. Furthermore, we haven't factored in Ukraine's aerial drone dominance nearer to the front lines, where rapid advances in Ukrainian technology have surpassed Russia's capabilities. Moreover, in a war where Ukraine's greatest weakness has always been manpower, Kyiv has introduced unmanned ground drones on a massive scale, using them to resupply and sustain troops in foxholes, or strapping machine guns onto them to capture territory autonomously. With drones shouldering such a high share of the combat burden, Ukrainian troops are much safer than before, and the reduced requirement for personnel on the front lines has allowed some Ukrainian soldiers the chance to rest and recover. Simultaneously, Ukraine's tactics are evolving. After a few months of testing in the less intense, more southerly parts of the front line, Kyiv has started to reintroduce artillery systems and even mechanized units under specific circumstances after years during which these systems were sitting ducks against drones on both sides. However, Ukraine's growing technological advantage is only half the battle. Kyiv has been tremendously aided by Russia's internal unraveling. Near the battlefield, Russia is losing an unprecedented number of troops before they even reach the front line. Although the Kremlin was able to recruit enough troops to replenish its forces for years, the calculus has recently flipped. Month after month in 2024, Russia has lost more troops than it can recruit, even as the country's remaining recruitment pool dwindles. Russia is particularly short on the types of units that would help stabilize the front line, especially drone operators, who have been recruited and trained in low numbers, targeted and killed in high numbers, and forced to accept cheap, ineffective drones from the drone force's new commander, a man with zero combat experience who clearly aims to monopolize his own drone company. In fact, the problem is so severe that Russian units outside the drone force have been ordered to surrender their drones, discarding one of the few assets that has kept Russians alive. On the home front, Ukraine's sustained long-range drone campaign has crippled military industry, contributed to deepening fuel shortages, and led Russian citizens to truly feel the impact of the war in a way they never had before. In a display of discontent that would have been unthinkable just a year ago, even instruments of the Russian state are beginning to reflect the changing reality. State pollsters are acknowledging that support for Putin is dropping rapidly, and military analysts and economists are publishing think pieces that insinuate or directly claim it is time for the war to end. Such statements are not made by Russian intellectuals unless the situation is becoming truly dire. According to insider reports, the Russian elite shares this sentiment. An oligarch speaking anonymously to The Guardian in May was quoted as saying, "There is profound disappointment in Putin, a growing sense that some kind of catastrophe is looming." All in all, Ukrainian leaders have assessed that they are facing optimal conditions for Kyiv to start making breakthroughs, but they have also acknowledged, as Brigadier General Biletskyi described, that this window will not remain open forever. This war has been a constant give and take between the Russian and Ukrainian sides. One side makes a rapid series of improvements and enjoys a temporary surge of momentum, but then the other side finds a way to catch up, and the momentum stabilizes or even reverses. In a worst-case scenario, 6 months is roughly how long Russia might need if Putin and his allies were to immediately get their act together and start finding ways to thwart Ukraine's recent successes. Even in a better scenario, 6 months from now, when winter sets in, advances become much tougher, and Ukraine is forced to endure months of attacks on its civilian energy infrastructure. Thus, these next 6 months constitute the critical window. If Ukraine is to find its way to the finish line, it must happen now. Right now in Kyiv, the clock is already ticking. Approximately 180 days to break the back of the Russian offensive once and for all. Before that can happen, Ukraine will need to accomplish 3 key tasks: deliver meaningful strategic setbacks to Russia on the battlefield, cripple the Russian capabilities that would allow it to stabilize despite setbacks, and arguably most importantly, convince Vladimir Putin that the war is lost. Putin's perception truly matters here. He is surrounded by people who are terrified to give him bad news, and who know they can enrich themselves by first delivering good news and then positioning themselves to siphon away the funds Putin allocates to what he believes to be further offensives. According to Kremlin insiders, Putin still believes that Russia is on track to capture the rest of the Donbass region, considering the potential cost to anyone who might give Putin a reality check. Ukraine cannot rely on the idea that Putin would learn the truth on his own. Ukrainian forces must make the truth unavoidable, because if there is any way for Putin's advisors to keep him in the dark, they will. As for how Ukraine goes about changing the situation, a growing chorus of war experts is sounding the alarm that a counteroffensive might be within reach. Even if Kyiv can achieve such an outcome, it will not be a counteroffensive across the entire front line, or even a territorial recapture on the scale of what Ukraine achieved in 2023. Kyiv simply does not have the available manpower for that, and even if it did, the risk is too great. Instead, if a counteroffensive does take place, it is likely to focus on relatively small geographic areas where Ukraine believes it can establish overwhelmingly favorable conditions for victory. This means concentrating incredible numbers of drones and drone operators, using tactics similar to what the architect of Ukraine's offensive drone strategy, Ilya Sekharin, has explained on Power Doctrine. Judging by Ukraine's recent successes in moving mobile howitzers, main battle tanks, and armored personnel carriers into frontline areas, those assets will probably be deployed as a true force multiplier in areas where Ukraine already controls the sky. Regarding potential targets, the most obvious is Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, which Russia has controlled since 2022. Ukrainian troops appear to be moving within striking distance of the plant, and if it could be recaptured, Ukraine would deprive Russia of some of its most important leverage. Since the plant was taken over, Russia has engaged in a long, theatrical display of nuclear blackmail, and if the war were to conclude with the power plant in Russian hands, it would be a massive boon to the Russian and occupied Ukrainian energy sector. Elsewhere, although Ukraine is neither close enough to take Crimea nor in a position of sufficient forces for that kind of operation, Kyiv may try to get as close to Crimea as possible to demonstrate its ability to threaten the isthmus in the future. Ukrainian advances in the Donbass are also possible, though they would be modest, with Ukraine starting to make limited advances toward the city of Pokrovsk. In the north, Ukraine may try to bleed Russia dry near the city of Sumy, where Russian forces have recently captured a number of abandoned villages that Ukraine did not seriously attempt to defend, likely in an effort to boost perceptions that Russia is still gaining ground month over month. That outward push, however, may have left those troops overextended. Then there is Ukraine's long-range strike campaign, with Ukrainian drones falling over St. Petersburg during an extremely high-profile international event while Putin was in the city. It is clear that Russian air defenses no longer have the strength to consistently prevent Ukraine from hitting high-value targets. What Ukraine may choose to do next is expand the volume of its strikes rather than its range or production lines. More capable long-range weaponry has been coming online with greater regularity over the last few months, and recent Ukrainian strikes have suggested a greater willingness to concentrate drones and missiles to hammer specific targets instead of spreading them out and trying to elude air defenses. This means Ukraine will need to build and purchase those weapons in greater numbers, and in that regard, help is already on the way from Europe. Recently, the EU unlocked a delivery of 90 billion euros across 2 years, a full 2/3 of which will be funneled toward military capabilities. Ukraine does have a number of other priorities when choosing how to allocate those funds, but if Kyiv truly believes it is just a few months away from victory, then the potential is obvious. Surge that funding into the acquisition of as many long-range weapons as possible until Ukraine's recent long-range sanctioning campaign against Russian oil infrastructure looks like child's play in comparison. Again, it is critical to remember that Ukraine's objectives would not be to defeat Russia outright, but to force Russia into as favorable a negotiating position for Ukraine as possible. That is a principle a number of Ukrainian leaders have reiterated over the last few days, including President Zelensky himself. Objective number 1 is to get Putin to the negotiating table. Objective number 2 is to ensure that once negotiations begin, Russia is willing to support an unconditional ceasefire or perhaps even make concessions to end the war. In past rounds of talks that barely qualified as negotiation, Putin and his allies stonewalled, demanded that Ukraine abandon territory it had not captured, and tried to impose a wide range of concessions on Kyiv. But if Ukraine can accomplish what it believes to be possible over the span of the next 6 months, then the ultimate hope is that those roles could be reversed. Ukraine could demand more stringent security guarantees and deterrence against future Russian aggression, or call for assurances that its path to NATO and the European Union will not be obstructed. Ideally, Ukraine would be able to convince Russia that there is simply no possibility that Russia would gain territory through negotiations beyond what would eventually be agreed as a concrete line of contact. And perhaps there is an outside chance that Ukraine could negotiate a return of some territory that has been lost, although that would be a stretch with this Russian leadership. Either way, Ukrainian leaders seem to have decided that the events of the next 6 months will set the stage for a genuine negotiation effort. Now that this knowledge is openly discussed, Ukraine, Russia, and the rest of the world will all be operating with a somewhat clearer timeline. Ukraine does not have to meet Russia at the negotiating table in 6 months. It could continue if this next stretch of warfare does not go as planned, or if this stretch goes so well that Kyiv wants to press an advantage. But Russia will be trying to hold out. Ukrainian soldiers will be counting down the days until they can finally go home, and Europe and the United States will be eager to return to normal. Ukraine has set a clear expectation on when and how this war might end, and now it is of the utmost importance that Ukraine can uphold its end of the bargain.